welcome to the second day. I'd like to introduce now Marcel Siegler, who is going to be presenting a paper entitled Dialectics of Society, Sartre's Theory of Practical Ensembles. And if you want to, as in yesterday, tell us a little bit about how this fits into your research, or generally before you begin, that'd be really fantastic. Thank you.
I will. Let me just stop my video so I can share the screen. Because now sharing. Okay, I hope you can see this now. Can you all see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so yes, hello and welcome to my talk about Sartre's theory of practical ensembles. As I was already introduced, my name is Marcel Siegler, and I'm actually a philosopher of technology. I did my PhD at TU Darmstadt in a graduate school on urban infrastructures. So it's quite odd, but I try to apply Sartre's later theory for a more nuanced understanding of the relation between individuals and forms of societal organization, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. In the next 30 minutes, I will shortly outline some key insights from my PhD thesis, in which I identified a larger framework of ideas, assumptions, and theoretical considerations in the later works of Sartre that culminate in a conception of what he refers to as practical ensembles in his later work. What I intend to do in this talk is to explore the theoretical foundations of practical ensembles in Sartre's philosophy and to outline the principles and dynamics of their formation, transformation, and persistence. However, due to the sheer theoretical depth of Sartre's later work, I can only outline the broader conceptual interrelations of Sartre's theory on practical ensembles. I hope that my talk will not be all too abstract for that matter, but I am happy to discuss the details with you afterwards. I'm really glad that Celine already provided a lot of information on the later Sartre's thoughts on subjectivity. In this talk, I try to provide more of an outside and systemic perspective towards the themes of critique. As I will try to show today, in Sartre's philosophy, a practical ensemble represents a structured interplay of human and non-human elements within which the conditions of possibility for human agency and the concrete courses of human action are dialectically constituted, mediated, and moderated, as well as manifested and consolidated over space and time. In this sense, considering a form of organization a practical ensemble does not mean to consider it as a specific form of organization. Rather, it means to understand it from a specific perspective towards the constitutive factors through which forms of organization become what they are in the first place. In my talk, I will first introduce a unified account of human action as dialectical totalization based on a complementary reading of Sartre's works. This is the very foundation of not only Sartre's philosophy in general, but his social ontology in particular. Then I will talk about the conditions of possibility of human society that Sartre locates in the struggle against scarcity or rarité and the practical inertia of technological artifacts and structures. After this, I will explain my above definition of practical ensembles in a bit more detail before I talk about the formation, transformation, and persistence of societal constellations from the perspective of practical ensembles. Due to the time limit, I cannot talk about the potential crisis and disruption of practical ensembles through counter-finalities, but if you want to, we can discuss this later. Let's start with human action as dialectical totalization. In an interview with New Left Review, Sartre states that the quintessential problem at the heart of his philosophy is how to give man both his autonomy and his reality among real objects, avoiding idealism without lapsing into a mechanistic materialism. We heard this quote yesterday already. Sartre's principal methodology towards this question consists in analyzing the nature of human world relations while taking praxeological, phenomenological, ontological, materialist, and most of all, dialectical considerations into account. Cornerstone of all of Sartre's philosophical writings is his dialectical conception of human action as a totalizing process on the basis of ontological freedom. Whereas Sartre more implicitly scrutinizes the internal dialectics of positing being and negating consciousness in his early work Being and Nothingness, he explicitly deals with the external dialectics of individual and history in his later works Search for a Method and Critique of Dialectical Reason. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre mentions that to act is to modify the way the world is figured. To arrange the means in view of an end, it is to produce an organized instrumental structure such that, through a series of sequences and connections, the modification brought about in one of the links brings in its wake modifications in the entire series and, in the end, produces some foreseen result. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre refers to praxis as an organizing project which transcends material conditions towards an end and inscribes itself through labor in inorganic matter as a rearrangement of the practical field and a reunification of means in the light of the end. Juxtaposing these two conceptions of action reveals some structural similarities between them. Both highlight the material basis of human existence and action, and both consider action to be a goal-directed implementation of means towards previously posited ends. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre explains how the goal-directedness of human existence concretely arises in the form of desires, or désir as lacks of being, due to which human beings strive for completion. A desire for, like instance, thirst arises in the human organism both as a relation to itself and its social, material, and cultural surroundings. This means that it arises on the basis of the ontological freedom of human beings. In feeling physical symptoms of thirst, human beings simultaneously disclose themselves as being in a state of exigency or exigence, and on the way to transform this exigent state through action. Once transformed, human beings interiorize the world anew and discover that they are in another state of exigency that they transform over and over. According to this understanding of the unhappy consciousness, human existence is a constant dialectical mediation of practical freedom through transformation and material necessity through exigency on the basis of a deeper ontological freedom. Let's get back to action as totalization. I mentioned that thirst projects to the end of not being thirsty and reveals the necessary action of drinking something as a way to transform the exigent state into a satisfied one. This mechanism works as well for the later Sartre and his conception of praxis, although not from a perspective of desires, but from a perspective of needs or besoin. I will come to this in a moment. The later Sartre underpins these more concrete mechanics of how needs and desires project to ends in relation to the social, material, and cultural environment on the basis of human existence as a relation to itself with a functional principle of totalization. A totalization represents a developing unification of partialities into totalities. This unification proceeds as a dialectical three-step of position, negation, and negation of the negation, also known as sublation. According to Sartre, a totalization represents a complex interlocking of processes in which human beings exteriorize interiorities while also interiorizing exteriorities in the process of self and world realization. This means that an action represents a constant, unfinished feedback adjustment between individual and environment in mutual constitution through each other. It represents the dialectical spiral that Christina Howells mentioned yesterday. Let me explain this in a bit more detail with the example of thirst. To repeat this once more in the context of totalization, when human beings feel thirsty, they are revealed to be in a state that they generally consider to be rather unpleasant due to various physical and mental stimuli, such as a dry mouth or a slight headache. These stimuli result from a lack of water in the human body. These physical stimuli can be considered what's called a position qua being in dialectical terms. However, due to the processual and dialectical character of human existence, there never is such a thing as a position plain and simple. In that human beings experience and thus unify these individual stimuli, they interiorize them within their corporeality as a larger symptom complex that they usually refer to as thirst. In doing so, these human beings are also revealed to project towards a different state of the world that they deem satisfying. In dialectical terms, this projection towards an end can be considered an abstract negation. Since human beings are always projecting from present to future, they thus exist in a contradictory state of superposition between thirsty and not thirsty. Within this lived contradiction, they also have a vague outline of a mediating activity between the two states in the act of drinking something, and most importantly, they also identify a set of material things to be the necessary mediators that must be involved in their mediating activity. Depending on the situation-specific coefficient of utility and adversity of these mediators, human beings may use these things as potential means to attain their ends. In this particular case, the means are a certain liquid that may satisfy their thirst and some sort of container to hold the liquid. Realizing the action of drinking said liquid represents an exteriorization of the interior and abstract end into a concrete end, as well as a concomitant transition from the human being's unsatisfying state to their potentially satisfactory state. In this way, they have realized what is called a practical sublation in dialectical terms. They transform the world through their action and can again interiorize the practical inert residuals of their actions in the world, thus spiraling towards their future in an oscillating movement of freedom and necessity. In this ablation, human beings transcend, conserve, and elevate themselves, the means that they employ towards their ends, and their world towards a different material state. Every entity within the course of action derives their situation-specific meaning within this concrete interaction. Human beings totalize themselves as acting subjects and ends in themselves. They also totalize the things they employ and other situational factors as the objective conditions that frame their action by providing their field of equivalentality. In this context, Sartre emphasizes the situatedness of human existence and action. Situational factors such as sociality, culture, and the material features of the environment shape the concrete course of human actions. These factors thus also shape how human beings realize themselves as well through their actions. For instance, depending on the structural integrity of the human body, how they grew up, how they were socialized, and what their environment offers them, different beverages and ways of drinking may come to mind whenever human beings feel thirsty. In the different ways they satisfy their needs and desires with what is at hand, they realize different subjectivities in relation to their social material and cultural environment. What is important to note, however, is the fact that in the shift from being a nothingness to critique of dialectical reason, Sartre shifts his perspective from desires as désir to needs as besoin. This shift in perspective is not so much due to a supposed difference between a besoin and a désir, as if besoins or needs are supposedly more physical or implicit ones, whereas désir or desires are supposedly mental or explicit and conscious ones. According to Sartre, the relation between désir and besoin is what's relevant. A désir is a socialized or mediated way to relate to initially immediate besoin. It is a socially co-constructed way of how human beings interiorize their ends and project towards them by exteriorizing themselves through their actions. Let's consider a thirsty baby, for instance. In the early days, right after being born, this baby may cry due to generally unpleasant feelings that result from not having been fed. In these early days, the baby cries due to a besoin, an immediate need for liquids and nourishment. When the besoin of the baby is repeatedly satisfied by the caretaker through breastfeeding or a nursing bottle, the baby cries due to how it relates to their besoin through the désir for the caretaker's breast or for the bottle. The immediate besoin has become a mediated désir on the foundation of the larger social structure in which the baby is born into and the pre-established ways in which their needs are satisfied. The same is true for all the social materially and culturally structured ways in which human beings satisfy their needs and desires. By differentiating between désir and besoin, Sartre is able to not only scrutinize the very foundation of the goal-directedness of human existence from within the logic of social constellations, but to question the conditions of possibility for the formation of these social constellations on the basis of human action. This brings us to the next part of this talk, scarcity and technology. Just a quick question is, am I still online? Because I can't check in my connection is sometimes bad.
Yes, okay. You are.
Okay, scarcity and technology as conditions of possibility of human societies. I will start with Sartre's understanding of the concept of scarcity. According to Sartre, all forms of human society and thus the entirety of human history is rooted in the relation between the fact that human beings are material organisms that must engage with their material surroundings to realize themselves by satisfying their needs and desires. And the fact that this material engagement can be so labor-intensive that it necessitates to either secure material resources or to ration the resources at one's disposal. Due to this initial relation between human wants and what is provided by the material surroundings, human beings usually interiorize themselves to be in a scarce milieu, as there either is or may not be enough resources for everyone. According to Sartre, it is always scarcity as a real and constant tension both between man and his environment and between man and man, which explains fundamental structures, techniques, and institutions, not in the sense that it is a real force and that it has produced them, but because they were produced in a milieu of scarcity by men whose praxis interiorizes the scarcity even when they try to transcend it. Sartre claims scarcity to be an inherently social relation that invokes both conflict and cooperation between individuals. In the course of conflict and cooperation, humans form larger forms of organization to systematically provide for their needs and desires. They hunt, grow wheat, herd cattle, protect and educate each other, fight wars, make peace. These forms of organization constitute and institutionalize themselves, not because scarcity appears to everyone in need through the need of others, but because it is negated in the unified field by praxis, by labor. Scarcity thus represents the abstract condition of possibility for human society and history. In that humans join together to provide for themselves and others, they partake in larger forms of societal organization, which they simultaneously totalize as the objective conditions that frame their actions. All of this happens in the course of the totalizing actions of these individual humans themselves. In this way, these humans socialize their immediate needs or besoins and turn them into socially mediated desires or désirs. To be thrown into forms of societal organization by birth, choice, or chance means to constantly mediate one's needs into desires. It also means to be subject to other, maybe even more complex needs that arise in relation to the technological means that humans have at their disposal and the practical constraints that arise due to the complex interactions between all elements in the ensemble. Technology, for that matter, plays a significant role in the way in which humans organize themselves. Although Sartre's earlier thoughts on technology seem to be largely inspired by Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, I believe that his later thoughts on the practical inert, together with his dialectical conception of human action and instrumentality, render him a dialectical philosopher of technology in his own right. Unfortunately, due to the 30 minutes I have for this talk, I cannot dive too deeply into Sartre's philosophical thoughts on technology. In short, according to Sartre's processual and dialectical understanding of human existence and action in relation to society, technological artifacts and structures represent ways in which human beings adapt to, routinize, and even enhance the way they satisfy their needs and desires within the forms of societal organization they partake in. Sartre claims that tools, machines, and other built structures have three distinct characteristics. First, they enable their users to put their own inertia into practice in order to realize themselves in the action situation. Second, they support their users in performing their actions. And third, they are materialized and thus practical inert options for action and forms of conduct. Due to its particular material properties and characteristics, any tool or machine is more favorable for attaining some ends, while more adverse for attaining other ends. This is what Sartre refers to as the coefficient of utility and adversity that I already mentioned. A knife, for instance, has a higher utility for cutting and stabbing, but a lower utility for hammering something. I can form my hands into a vessel to drink cold water, but when my desire projects me towards drinking hot coffee in the morning, I definitely prefer to use a cup. The same is true for all other technological artifacts. They are materialized strategies to attain certain ends our needs and desires project towards. In this regard, they represent practical inert ways of doing things. And all human societies are gathered and structured around technologies, from hunting tools over techniques for herding and breeding cattle to clothes and all kinds of housing and settlements, cities and nation states. The entirety of human existence and history is accompanied by technological artifacts and structures, as well as body, social, and cultural techniques. These technological artifacts and structures allow to more or less routinely, effectively, and efficiently satisfy our needs and desires in the same way as the people did that came before us. The problem, however, is when human beings can either no longer reflect that certain technological solutions are not the only way to satisfy their needs and desires, or when their position within forms of societal organization gives them no other choice than having to rely on certain technological means. This is what later Sartre calls la force des choses, the power of things or the power of circumstances. And it is exactly what happens due to the dynamics of practical ensembles. So what exactly is a practical ensemble? When Sartre speaks about forms of societal organization, such as families, factories, protest groups, and institutions, he uses pairs of terms like technical ensemble, social ensemble, human ensemble, material ensemble, and so on. In doing so, Sartre highlights the fact that these ensembles, in the original French meaning, represent wholenesses or Ganzheiten that comprise of elements in practical interaction with each other that perform certain actions together by dividing their labor in order to serve some larger functional requirement. Sartre's theory of practical ensembles thus provides a specific analytical perspective towards forms of societal organization, to which these organizational forms are disclosed as a structured interplay of human and non-human elements. Within this interplay, the conditions of possibility for human agency and the concrete courses of human action are dialectically constituted, mediated, and moderated, as well as manifested and consolidated over space and time. This mostly happens through the ways in which human actions are structured by their interaction with technology within these ensembles. Since human action provides the very foundation for how these organizational forms actually come together and transform in the course of human history, conceiving these organizational forms as practical ensembles means to deconstruct the very history of their formation on the basis of human action. In this way, approaching a form of societal organization as a practical ensemble means to understand this organizational form as a co-constructed interagential network or system of self-sustaining human agents in practical relation to non-human things and framed in their actions by historically grown and institutionalized social, material, and cultural factors. When I came to this conclusion, I could not stop but think of Bruno Latour's actor network theory, although both significantly differ in terms of how important the human element is for the overall plan of action and the functional requirements of the ensemble or network. In the spirit of Sartre's progressive method, the formation conditions and system status, if you want to call it that way, can be assessed regressively, while their transformation can be reconstructed progressively. What Sartre's theory of practical ensembles allows is to understand forms of social organization similar to a socio-technical system, the status of which can be analyzed by scrutinizing the way the actions of the human elements are mediated by the technical elements. This brings me to the next part, the formation and transformation of practical ensembles. Following Sartre's social ontology, it can be said that practical ensembles can be structured in either a predominantly serial or communal manner, although both modes of structuring overlap and interplay in practical ensembles. These two modes of structuring correspond to Sartre's thoughts about collectives and groups. I will begin with practical ensembles that are predominantly structured in a serial way. When a practical ensemble is united by isolated practical relations of human elements to non-human technological objects and structures, in dependence with prevalent material conditions, and when this practical ensemble furthermore remains defined by this conjunction, this ensemble is called a collective. In collectives, the functional interactions between elements are seen to be serially structured. This means that each element belonging to the ensemble is not a result of a conscious choice, but of each individual's isolated practical relation on the basis of the functional requirements and exigencies of these individuals. As a consequence of this serial structuring, the human elements in these ensembles remain in pure exterior relation to each other without interior cohesion. Sartre uses people waiting for the bus to exemplify serial structuring. Here I will do this with people waiting for a train. Initially, these people do not appear to be structured at all. They rather look like a general gathering consisting of a random number of individuals. However, when this gathering is conceived in a dialectical and praxeological way, their quote-unquote generality is just an abstract appearance, for it is actually constituted in its very multiplicity by its transcendent unity as a structured multiplicity. Through Sartre's conceptual lens, this multiplicity can be de-reconstructed according to the goal-oriented actions of its human elements, and in doing so, the multiplicity of people actually presents itself as a practical ensemble with serially structured functional interrelations between its elements. The individuals at the bus stop indeed represent a fixed constellation because the human elements of the ensemble are unified as isolated individuals whose actions, waiting, for instance, or having to buy flowers, a flower pot, I don't know, is equally conditioned by the same non-human technological elements, the train stop and the train in this case. This is because the non-human elements, especially the train, fulfill two functions. First, the train functions as a common and available means of transportation by which the human elements as historical individuals must satisfy their needs and desires for mobility in general and for reaching their workplace in particular. Second, the means also functions as a concrete way in which the provision of a needed good or service is reliably preserved for future use, and that these individuals have to rely on the repeated use of the same means of subsistence in an abstract way. They are subject to a passive synthesis. Although such a passive synthesis is still enacted by individual praxis, the unity it represents must be dialectically understood as the affirmation of a pre-established positing through sociocultural and material conditions, instead of being an active engagement with these conditions in the sense of a dialectical negation. Another example of a serially structured practical ensemble can be found in Sartre's thoughts on class being. Sartre states that at the origin of class membership, there are passive syntheses of materiality. These syntheses represent both the general conditions of social activity and our most immediate, crudest objective reality. They are simply the crystallized practice of previous generations. Individuals find an existence already sketched out for them at birth. What is assigned to them is a type of work and a material condition and a standard of living tied to this activity. It is a fundamental attitude as well as a determinative provision of material and intellectual tools. It is a strictly limited field of possibilities. In this understanding, societal classes and other structures that are organized around something like race and gender represent practical ensembles in which certain individuals are assigned a fixed field of possibilities that more or less strictly limits these individuals to a pre-established and socially co-constructed way to realize themselves. When individuals are thus forced to have to sustain themselves on the basis of the means that are assigned to them due to their position within their practical ensemble, these individuals also necessarily have to acquiesce to the fact that they reinforce the larger structures of their ensemble by realizing these structures as the objective conditions of their actions. These individuals may still live their lives on the basis of their ontological freedom by employing the means that have been assigned to them to sustain themselves, even if these lives do not necessarily have to be good lives. Fortunately, individuals can join and cooperate to try to transform how their practical ensembles are structured. Due to the limited field of possibilities prevalent in serially structured ensembles, individuals that are situated in these ensembles can be threatened by the fact that some of their needs and desires are not provided for, either because certain options for action do not exist, or because the serial structures of their ensemble actively constrain these individuals in satisfying their needs and desires. Concrete instances of this can be the identification of exploitative labor conditions, a lack of political representation, control, or governmental regulation, an overall lack of certain options for action, or in a most abstract case, the non-existence of any form of organization through which individuals may exceed power over themselves. When a practical ensemble forms in the active attempt of its human elements to eliminate or change how the conjunction of technological artifacts and sociocultural as well as material conditions prefabricates their serial unity, and when this newly found practical ensemble furthermore remains defined by its undertaking, this ensemble represents a preliminary group called a group infusion that exhibits a communal structure. It follows that any group infusion presupposes certain predominant structures of seriality against which the group infusion defines itself. A classic ensemble of a communally structured practical ensemble would be a social movement like, for instance, Fridays for Future. Members of Fridays for Future organize against the way in which the nations of the so-called global north, as practical ensembles, are structured to provide for the needs and desires of their human elements by exploiting nature and by fueling climate change through the overuse of fossil fuel. The members of Fridays for Future rebel against the serial structures they are situated in because they observe that these serial structures are not sustainable and will not last. In fact, the way in which nation states and the global market are structured already starts to constrain the fields of possibility of younger generations and marginalized groups through the counterfinality of climate change. Sartre, however, is not blind to the fact that communally structured practical ensembles may become serially structured over time. This can happen when groups form institutional structures, divide labor, and detach individuals from their functions by defining institutional roles as fixed function carriers, such as a treasurer or a speaker. Although such a restructuring of predominantly communally structured groups into predominantly serially structured institutions allows the institution to work more efficiently, thus increasing the way the institution carries out its functional requirement, it can lead to hierarchical structures that resemble those in societal classes. Again, individuals can join together to rebel against these newly formed serially structured practical ensembles, given that these individuals have not interiorized these structures as action dispositions in the form of hexis. This brings me to the next part of my talk, the persistence of practical ensembles. The structures of practical ensembles mainly persist in the practical inertia of technological things and structures on one side, and the practical inertia of human beings on the other. Since practical ensembles comprise of interactions between human and non-human elements, the way these ensembles persist must be located in the interconnection between the corporeality of human beings and their actions. Already in Being and Nothingness, Sartre understands this interconnection in terms of the Aristotelian concept of hexis, to which he refers to as exis in the French original. For Aristotle and for Sartre, a hexis represents an action disposition that is acquired in the course of repeated interactions between human beings and their surrounding social, material, and cultural environment in general, and the repeated interaction between these human beings and the technological artifacts and structures they employ on a daily basis in particular. Hexis thus represents a habituated way of performing actions. In this regard, Sartre's hexis resembles Bourdieu's habitus. Bourdieu, who discusses Sartre's critique of dialectical reason in his outline of the theory of practice, somehow seems to ignore Sartre's thoughts on hexes. Sartre exemplifies the formation of hexes with an airplane pilot and their airplane. He says, through training, professional instruction, etc., the instrument exists as an hexis in the practical organism of anyone whose function makes him use it. The hexis of the specialist must correspond to the signifying interconnections of the parts of a machine or tool as an interconnection of assemblies. Here, Sartre claims that human beings internalize and routinize those instrumental actions that they perform on a regular basis. Once acquired, routine opposes initiative. Of course, we do not have to be pilots in order to experience this in our daily lives. According to newer insights from the psychology of habit, roughly 43% of our daily activities are performed out of habit and triggered within certain material contexts instead of due to consciously projected ends. Nevertheless, Sartre claims that hexis is not an automated response or behavior that is somehow opposed to free praxis. Rather, praxis is the temporalization of hexis, and hexis is a disposition that shapes our action. He states that although our hexis, quote-unquote, scarcely resembles a praxis, and yet in fact, it is a praxis. Habit is directed and organized, the end posited, the means chosen. Still, the hexes of individual human beings allow for the perpetuation of practical ensembles, as they represent a form of the practical inert that resides within the concrete corporeality of these human beings. In that routine opposes initiative, human beings reinforce the structures of the practical ensembles in which they are situated in even further and start to normalize them. According to Sartre, if a state of equilibrium is established within a given mode of production and preserved from one generation to the next, it is preserved as hexis, that is to say, both as a physiological and social determination of human organisms and as a practical project of keeping institutions and physical corporate development at the same level. In that human beings repeat those practical relations and possibilities that have proven to yield the intended results so that these human beings may realize themselves, they interiorize and thus normalize these practical relations, and thus the practical ensemble in which they are situated in. This, Sartre continues, corresponds ideologically to a decision about human nature. Man is a stunted, misshapen being, hardened to suffering, and he lives in order to work from dawn till dusk, with these primitive technical means on a thankless, threatening earth. This basically is Sartre's understanding of ideology. Over time, human beings come to accept that the present way in which the practical ensemble is structured and in which these human beings can sustain themselves, no matter if in a good or bad, powerful or disempowered way, to be the only way in which the supra-individual satisfaction of needs and desires can be organized. According to the psychology of habit, our habit and thus our hexis can be broken. The most sustainable way to do so is to change the context in which these actions trigger. In Sartrean terms, this means that human beings have to materially transform the serial structures in which they are trapped through their self-sustaining actions. In that actions and the structures of our society become being, they cannot be dissolved into knowledge even if they are deciphered and known. Only matter itself, beating on matter, can break them up. Sartre's thoughts about how we are both thrown into forms of societal organization in which we necessarily situate ourselves through our ontologically free, self-sustaining actions on the basis of our needs and desires, and the way we reinforce these structures through our actions, and the way we interiorize these structures, show the inherently dialectical character of human existence, society, and history as a constant oscillation of freedom and necessity. We are thrown into the gears of needs, desires, individual, society, culture, and technology, and we are condemned to make the best of what has been made of us for ourselves. Thank you.